We're now in the squad room, or the main room, of Barracks Number 5, again reflecting the U.S. Army in the 1870s and the 1880s. Very simple room. The Army did not spend, or the government did not spend, a lot of money on its soldiers, and so it was simplicity and utilitarian at best. Each soldier got his own bunk, a box at the end of his bed for his equipment and storage, and a shelf and some pegs at the other end for his uniform. And that was about it. You were not allowed a lot of personal gear or a lot of extra necessities. If you couldn't keep them hidden in the box, then the Army didn't want to see them. This is a room which we have a lot of fun with during the year, particularly during our Christmas event over the first weekend of December. This room will be full of reenactment soldiers portraying the Army of old. Occasionally you'll hear a creak on the boards. The boards are laid out in a period style, and so they creak and groan when you walk across them. The heating and the cooling systems reflect the day. You have a big fireplace, which is behind me here, and it's not lit at the moment. If it were, I'd be moving at this point, because that fireplace throws out a huge amount of heat in a 20 to a 30-foot radius. We have some stoves, which are more props than functional. And that was pretty much the heating system for the winter. In the summer, the cooling came via the doors and the windows, and while that brought fresh breezes, it also brought dust, and inevitably it brought flies. So in today's air-conditioned 24/7 comfort zone, I think most folks would have a very hard time sleeping and living, but this was the way it was back in the 1870s. And during a tour, a visitor will get to see this anytime from a distance. Behind our visitor barriers, and if they take a guided tour, the soldier in uniform will walk them right through and even let them sit on one of the beds and try on a coat. Each of the soldiers' barracks at Fort Concho and virtually any other western fort had their own mess hall, a facility where the soldiers cooked their meals and ate them. The Army designed it all this way to build the efficiency and the camaraderie of the unit. The basic fighting unit of the Army was the company, or troop, usually between 25 and 60 men. The untold story is the way they cooked. You may think that the Army had professional cooks in those days, and they did not. They rotated the duty. The theory being that if you were a soldier who didn't know much about food or came from the big city where someone else cooked for you, it was essential that you learned how to cook and prepare your rations, particularly when you were posted to field duty. So the sergeant's responsibility was to rotate the cooking duties among 3 or 4 men every so many weeks, which resulted in a widely varying quality of the food. But it did teach the men the basics of cooking. The other challenge with food in the Army was simply one of transport, also logistics and cost. Again, the budget was always tight. You could not get fresh meat and vegetables all the time in the West, and out here growing things, what you call, I guess, dry land farming, was particularly hard, and there was never enough irrigated farming area to feed everyone, so your vegetables were not as plentiful as necessary. Knowledge of the basic food groups, or whatever you would call the food pyramid, were not in style. And cost, again, was a consideration. And last but not least, with a total lack of refrigeration, the concept of leftovers just wasn't there. You ate it all up, or maybe you saved it the next meal, and that was about it. So the diet was rather bland, heavy on the starches, the greases, and basic meats. No dairy products to speak of, and just rather monotonous, to say the least. Breakfast was mush or salt pork, bread and coffee. Lunch, what they called dinner back then, the big meal of the day, because you were in the middle of the Army workday, was some kind of hash or meat with maybe potatoes, possibly carrots and onions. And then your supper was a light meal of the day, very much in contrast to the way we eat today, where most folks have their big meal in the evening. Supper in the Army was maybe, again, coffee and bread, which were the staple of any meal, and perhaps maybe some leftovers, mush, or maybe just some boiled vegetables, or maybe an occasional piece of fruit. The Army was done with you at that point in your workday, and they weren't interested in giving you a big meal before going to bed. Again, this room is available during the walking tour, and we do also some children's programs in here. And occasionally, when we do reenactments, you'll find men in blue uniforms sitting and eating food just the way it was done a century plus ago. This is the Fort Concho Schoolhouse and Chapel, and it was the last building erected at Fort Concho over the spring of 1879, and represents the end of what we call the building period in the fort's history. A little bit of a story of its creation: it was never intended to be. Up until 1879, the post chaplain had to hold his services in his schoolroom in any building he could find. The Army never did assign the funding to build a chapel. In the late 1870s, the fort had 9 officers' quarters, and they were budgeted for a 10th, and so they built the basement for it. And it's one of the few basements we have on the site. But then that was a year, 1878 and 79, when the Army budget was all thrown into chaos, and the Congress virtually adjourned without appropriating any money for the Army at all. So it was a time when the soldiers and the officers weren't paid. But the foundation existed, and the post chaplain prevailed upon the post commander to take what limited funding could be found to build a schoolroom and a chapel. And that's what we have today. It's a very small room. It looks large, but it's quite small in its layout. It's about 40 feet by, about 15 or 16 feet tops. But we get a lot of use out of it. Many of the viewers will recognize it if they remember their 4th grade days. If they went through the 4th grade as far back as 1976, it's been the home of what we call the Frontier School Program, where every 4th grader in the city, the county, and many surrounding districts come out and spend a whole day, well, half a day, as a student in the 1880s style, with the girls wearing pullover smocks and the boys wear suspenders, and they carry their lunches in buckets, and it's a lot of fun. And they sit at these tables and learn their lessons out of McGuffey's Readers, and a soldier or a schoolmarm stands at the far end by the desk and does their reading, writing, and arithmetic just the way their great-great-grandparents may have learned. We've also had a few weddings in here. It's not a building that's conducive to large weddings, so it's not very popular for that, but on occasion it has occurred, and we've had a few period weddings. In fact, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had folks dress up in their 1870s costumes and uniforms, reenactors for real, and have gotten hitched or rehitched, so to speak. It also serves as the entertainment building, one of the entertainment buildings for our Christmas event over the first weekend of December, so you'll hear a wide range of music coming out of here, children's choirs, gospel, traditional caroling and hymns, and at night with the lights off and lanterns, or even with the lights on, it makes for a very fetching scene and kind of takes you back in time. One of the largest buildings, in fact the largest building at the fort, was the post hospital, and right now we're inside what will be called the bathing room at the hospital. Very sparsely set out, but with things that probably folks today would recognize: soap and a pitcher and a sponge pan and a sponge and raising shaving equipment and a bathtub, or a sitting bathtub. It's a little hard to step back in time on this one, but while folks back then did understand and appreciate the importance of bathing, it was not the everyday issue that we take for granted today. A bath once a week was rarely enforced. Sergeants and corporals were supposed to inspect their soldiers' feet at least once every month or two. I suspect it too was rarely enforced. Of course, you can't be a good infantry soldier without good feet. This hospital building is recreated. It's built based on period photos and plans. It was all rebuilt in the late 1980s as part of a multi-building project that rebuilt a new elementary school just behind us and took down the old one on the parade ground. We've laid out several rooms of it to period scale, and this is one of them. And in a moment, we'll go across and show the toilet facilities of the 1800s.